A dust-covered trunk sits in an attic corner for decades, untouched, forgotten, and sealed shut. One day, someone drags it into the light, fingers tracing the worn metal latch, hesitating before lifting the lid. Inside are faded photos of children, stacks of letters tied with string, and papers stamped with names and dates that don't match any story the town remembers. One envelope holds a handwritten note with missing records, crossed-out names, and a child's identity written clearly at the bottom. As the pages spread across the floor, the quiet house turns into a timeline, and every item points to one question. Where did the children go? The old trunk sat untouched in the corner of the attic, the layers of dust on its surface thicker than time itself. The wood, once rich in color, had darkened with age, its grain warped from decades of neglect. Yet despite its quiet existence, the trunk seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it held memories of lives long gone, and secrets far deeper than its weathered exterior let on. In that quiet space, the very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to uncover what it kept hidden for so many years. For decades, it had been ignored, another forgotten relic of the past in a house that had grown too old, too silent. But there it was, waiting to be discovered. To an outsider, the trunk seemed like nothing more than an old piece of luggage, perhaps once used to carry clothes or possessions from one home to another. But to those who knew its origins, it was more than that. It was a link to a dark chapter of American history, a chapter few ever dared to revisit. And so it remained there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment, the right pair of hands, to pry it open and peer inside. Who would have known that the simple act of opening that trunk would reveal something that had been buried for generations? Who could have guessed that this forgotten relic, covered in dust and layers of time, would hold the key to one of the most unsettling mysteries of the orphan train movement? It all began in 1922, a year like many others in the rural towns of America, a year of ordinary events and unnoticed tragedies. But for one small town, it would mark the beginning of a story that will remain untold for nearly a century. That's when the trunk, sturdy, old, and worn, had found its way into the attic of an unsuspecting caretaker. She was a woman who lived alone, a woman who had dedicated much of her life to taking in orphan children, offering them a home in a world that seemed unwilling to care for them. But she was a figure wrapped in mystery, someone whose history was as hazy as the cobwebs in the corners of the attic where the trunk would eventually be stored. She had always kept to herself, avoiding questions about her past, deflecting when anyone dared to ask about her role in the orphan train system, a system that had been responsible for transporting thousands of orphan children across the country in search of new families. For those who knew her, the caretaker seemed like a woman who could have stepped out of a forgotten dream, someone who moved through the world with a sense of purpose but never spoke much of herself. She was kind, yes, but there was a distance in her eyes, a weariness that spoke of something hidden, something that had weighed on her for years. The children she took in were cared for, but there was always an air of finality about them. They came, they stayed, and then they moved on one by one, leaving behind little more than fading memories and photographs tucked away in forgotten drawers. The caretaker never spoke of them after they left, never acknowledged their absence, and when the children grew older, they stopped asking about the ones who had disappeared without a trace. But no one could have predicted what would happen the day the trunk was opened. It wasn't just a simple uncovering of an old box that had been left to gather dust over the years. It was the unlocking of a past that had been deliberately sealed away, a past that had been hidden not only from the world, but from the very people who had once trusted the caretaker. Inside the trunk, nestled among yellow clothes and fraying fabric, was a collection of objects, things that didn't belong, things that had no place in the life of an ordinary woman. There were letters, some sealed and others open, their edges curling from age. There were photographs, faded, grainy images of children, some smiling, some staring blankly into camera, their expressions distant, almost lost. But it was the content of an old envelope, tucked carefully under clothes, that would send ripples through the investigation. The letter inside was written in a hurried, jagged hand. It was a note of sorts, and it spoke of secrets, secrets that had been buried, secrets that were never meant to be found. The letter mentioned names, places, and events that seemed entirely disconnected from the life the caretaker had lived in that small town. There were references to children who had disappeared, to families that never received the children they were promised, to homes where orphans had been forced to live in silence, never allowed to speak of what had truly happened to them. As the letter was read aloud by the investigators, the room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with the weight of the revelation. The pieces began to fall into place, but they didn't fit together easily. The caretaker, this woman who had once appeared so kind, so trustworthy, had been hiding something far more sinister. The trunk, the letters, the photographs, they were not just remnants of a past life. They were clues to a story that no one had been allowed to tell, a story that had been locked away in the darkest corners of memory and time. And then there was a name. It was a name that didn't belong in the caretaker's world, a name that was too familiar for comfort. It was a name tied to a child who had disappeared years before, a child whose fate had never been explained. But here, in this old trunk, the child's name was written plainly, as if it was a detail too important to ignore. And suddenly, everything changed. The mystery deepened, and the questions multiplied. Who was this child? Why had they been hidden? And what had happened to them? The trunk, which had once been a simple container of forgotten belongings, had become a symbol of the mysteries buried beneath the surface of history. Each item inside it carried with it a fragment of a story that had been silenced for far too long. The more the investigators looked, the more questions arose. The caretaker had been hiding a life, an entire past, behind her carefully constructed persona. But the trunk revealed a different truth, a truth that would force everyone to confront the darkness of the orphan train system, a system that had been both a beacon of hope and a source of unimaginable pain. As the content of the trunk were pieced together, the reality of what had occurred in that quiet, seemingly innocent home began to take shape. And in the background, always there but never fully acknowledged, was a chilling question. How many other trunks like this one were out there, waiting to be uncovered, each one holding its own tragic secrets? In that moment, the past and present seemed to collide, and the weight of the unanswered questions became too heavy to ignore. The orphan trains had carried thousands of children across the country, each one with their own story, their own hopes, their own fear. But for some of them, the journey had ended long before they arrived at their destination. The trunk, now opened, was a silent witness to the pain and the loss that had been concealed for far too long. The caretaker's role in the orphan train system had always been shrouded in mystery, but now, as the trunk lay open before the investigators, it became clear that the woman who had once been seen as a guardian of orphans was in fact something else entirely. And the trunk, in its stillness, seemed to whisper the truth, if only they were willing to listen. The discovery of the trunk was just the beginning, a spark that would ignite a journey into the past. The emotional and psychological depth of the story, the sense of loss, of things unsaid, would begin to unfold with each new piece of evidence. And as the investigators delved deeper into the mystery, the weight of the past would continue to haunt them, urging them to uncover the full extent of what had been hidden, and to finally reveal the truth that had been locked away in the trunk for so long. The orphan train movement began in the mid-1800s, at a time when the United States was still grappling with the aftershocks of the Civil War and the growing pains of a young nation trying to understand its place in the world. Poverty, disease, and industrialization had created a generation of orphaned and abandoned children, and the orphanages of the eastern cities were overflowing. In New York alone, thousands of children roamed the streets, abandoned by parents who could no longer care for them. The streets, once bustling with the promise of a better life, now felt like a prison for these children, many of whom were barely clinging to life. They wandered without direction, often living on scraps, falling prey to disease, or worse, exploitation. The idea of sending children westward on trains to be placed with families in rural America was conceived by Charles Loring Brace, a man who had witnessed firsthand the hardships these children faced. Brace was the founder of the Children's Aid Society, an organization that would spearhead the orphan train movement. He believed that the children would be better off in rural, agrarian environments where they could be adopted by farming families. For many, this would be a chance at a new life, a chance to escape the squalor of the cities and become part of family. In theory, the idea seemed like a beacon of hope in an otherwise dark world. However, what began as a solution to an overwhelming problem soon became a complicated and morally ambiguous system. The trains, loaded with children, crisscrossed the country, stopping in small towns and farms where the children would be chosen by prospective families. These were not always kind families. There were few rules or regulations in place to ensure the safety or well-being of the children. Some were adopted into loving homes, but for many others, their lives would be marked by hardship, cruelty, and abuse. The orphan train system, designed as a lifeline for children who had nowhere else to go, quickly revealed a darker side. In many cases, children were treated as little more than free labor. They worked the fields, performed menial chores, and were often separated from their siblings without any regard for the emotional toll that this would take. The idea of finding a home was not always as it appeared. Some children found themselves in households where they were little more than servants, their needs ignored, their voices silenced. While some families may have genuinely wanted to help, others were simply looking for someone to do the work that no one else wanted to do. By the time the orphan train system came to an end in the 1930s, it had transported over 200,000 children across the country, from the crowded streets of New York City to the quiet farms of the Midwest. But not all of them found homes. Some children simply disappeared, lost in the system, their fates unknown. For decades, these children's stories remained untold, their disappearances brushed aside. The records of the orphan train system were often incomplete or destroyed, and as the years passed, the stories of the children who never arrived at their destinations faded into obscurity. Yet, as time wore on, there were whispers of what happened to the children who had vanished. Some survivors of the orphan train system later came forward to share their stories, and what they revealed was far darker than anyone could have imagined. They spoke of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Some spoke of children being taken from their families under false pretenses, promised a better life only to find themselves working in grueling conditions for families who were more interested in free labor than in caring for them. These survivors told of broken promises and shattered dreams, of lives stolen by a system that was meant to help but instead often harmed. It was into this world, this broken and forgotten system, that the mysterious caretaker entered. She was a figure shrouded in uncertainty, her past known to only a few, and even those who knew her had little understanding of the role she played in the orphan train movement. She had been a caretaker, someone who took in children, offering them shelter and a home. But her home was not a typical one, and the children who came to her were often never seen again. No one ever asked questions. The town, small and quiet, never pried into the affairs of others. The caretaker had been there long enough, and her presence, though enigmatic, was accepted without question. She had a reputation, though it wasn't entirely clear what was based on. People described her as a kind woman, a woman who had a knack for making the children feel welcome. But there was something about her that made others uneasy. She was always willing to help, always eager to take in children who needed a home. Yet, she rarely spoke about her own life, and when the subject of the orphan trains came up, she would quickly change the subject. Some said she had worked for the Children's Aid Society, that she had been involved in the transportation of children, but she never confirmed it, never spoke about her connection to the system. She seemed to hold herself at a distance, guarding her past like a precious secret, and no one asked her to reveal it. The children who were sent to her were often the ones who had nowhere else to go, the ones who had been deemed unadoptable by other families or who had been left behind. They were often younger, quieter, and more withdrawn than the others. Some had been abandoned by their parents, while others had been orphaned by disease or tragedy. They were children who had suffered, and for a time, the caretaker's home seemed like a sanctuary from the horrors they had endured. But there was always something unsettling about the way the children came and went. They never stayed long, and after they left, the caretaker never spoke of them again. It was as though they had never existed. What happened to them? Were they truly better off in the care of the mysterious woman who took them in? And why did she keep to herself, refusing to discuss her past or the children she had raised? As the years passed, the questions surrounding the caretaker's role in the orphan train system only grew. But no one dared to press her for answers. No one dared confront the truth of what she had done or failed to do. She had become an enigma, a shadow in the background of a story that most had long since forgotten. But the truth, as it always does, had a way of creeping to the surface. The discovery of the old trunk, hidden away in the attic of her house, would be the spark that lit the flame of a mystery long buried. Inside the trunk, there were pieces of the past that had been locked away, hidden from view, But they were not easily forgotten. The letters, the photographs, the names, all of these things held the keys to a story that had been waiting to be told. And now, as the trunk was opened and the secrets of the caretaker's past began to unfold, the long-forgotten children of the orphan train system would once again find their voices. The stories that had been buried for so long would rise to the surface, and the truth about the children who had disappeared would finally be revealed. But the discovery of the trunk would also raise new questions, questions that would lead to a deeper understanding of the caretaker's role in the orphan train system, and perhaps, just perhaps, reveal what had happened to the children she had never spoken of. The answers, however, would not come easily, and the journey to uncover them would take those involved down a path they had never expected to follow. The caretaker was a woman who existed in the margins of her own life. Her name was whispered in town, but no one knew much about her, and few dared to ask. She had lived in the same small house for as long as anyone could remember, a house nestled on the edge of the community, away from the hustle and bustle of town life. It was a modest home, surrounded by tall trees that shaded it from the world. Its exterior, though simple, had an air of permanence, as if it had withstood the passage of time with a quiet dignity. The garden, though untended in recent years, still bore traces of a once vibrant landscape, and there were signs of life in the form of stray cats that prowled around the property, always just out of reach, as elusive as their owner. She had been known to take in children, orphans, runaways, or those simply abandoned by their families, offering them shelter and food when they had nowhere else to turn. It was a role that seemed to define her life, yet it was one she never openly acknowledged. In town, they spoke of her in hushed tones, wondering if she was truly as benevolent as she seemed. After all, there was something about her that did not quite fit, something about her presence that seemed off-center, like a picture hung slightly askew on the wall. No one could quite put their finger on it, but there was an undeniable sense that the caretaker had a history, a past that she chose to keep hidden. It wasn't just her silence that was unsettling. It was the way she avoided any mention of her past, the way she would turn away from any questions about the children she had helped, as if the very idea of discussing them made her uncomfortable. She never spoke of the orphan train, never mentioned how she had come to be involved in it, and when people asked her about her early life, she deflected the inquiry with an almost practiced ease. Over the years, the children she had cared for came and went, often without ceremony. There were never any grand goodbyes, no promises of future visits, no words of affection. The children would leave, and she would quietly return to her solitary life. She was known to be kind enough in her own way, offering warm meals, a bed to sleep in, a safe haven from the world outside. Yet, there was always a distance in her manner, a subtle barrier that she never allowed anyone to cross. The children who stayed with her never seemed to form lasting attachments. They were often quiet, withdrawn, and kept to themselves, as if they had learned the art of self-preservation at an early age. They moved in and out of the caretaker's house like shadows, passing through, but never staying long enough to become truly known. There were whispers about the way the caretaker spoke to the children, about the look in her eyes when they asked her questions she didn't want to answer. They said her voice carried a strange chill when she spoke of the past, as if the mere mention of it brought with it an undeniable discomfort. When a new child arrived at her doorstep, she would always greet them with a smile that seemed genuine enough. But there was something about the way she looked at them, something that conveyed a quiet, unspoken understanding. It was as though she recognized the pain in their eyes, but never allowed herself to acknowledge it. She would never allow herself to get too close, to care too much. To do so, she must have reason, would be to risk something deeper, something that might break the fragile armor she had built around herself. She kept her distance, and in doing so, kept the children at arm's length, never allowing them the comfort of truly being at home. It was as though the caretaker had created a world of her own, one in which she was both the protector and the observer, but never a participant. She lived on the outskirts of the community, physically and emotionally, always present, yet never fully involved. Her life, as it seemed, was a quiet existence, one that offered no drama, no spectacle, no answers. And yet, for all her aloofness, she was never fully ignored. There was an undeniable pull in her quiet demeanor, a force that drew people in and made them want to understand her. They could never quite place her in any clear category. Was she a saint, a martyr, Or was she something altogether darker, a person whose kindness had something much more sinister beneath the surface? Her past was a void, and the townsfolk had learned not to ask about it. Those who came into her life were accepted with a level of grace, but no questions were ever allowed to linger. The children who passed through her doors were never given a chance to voice their own histories. Perhaps the caretaker simply didn't care enough to ask, or perhaps she had a rule she adhered to. Don't ask, don't tell. When the orphan train system began, it must have seemed like an answer to a prayer for many families who were struggling with the weight of orphan children. Children who were left on the streets, unwanted and uncared for, were given the opportunity to be adopted by families in the Midwest who were in desperate need of help. The movement promised them a chance at a new life, a new family, a future away from the squalor of the city. But for some, this was far from the fairy tale it appeared to be. The stories that began to surface were filled with pain and regret, of children being separated from their siblings, of harsh conditions in the homes they were sent to, of promises that were never kept. The caretaker's role in this system remained shrouded in mystery. Some people believed she was simply an employee of the Children's Aid Society, a compassionate woman tasked with facilitating the transportation of children to their new homes. Others believed that she was more involved, perhaps even orchestrating the movement of children for her own reasons. There were whispers that the caretaker wasn't as innocent as she appeared, that she had been involved in darker dealings, that her reasons for helping children were not entirely altruistic. But these whispers were never substantiated, and the caretaker, for all her reticence, never gave anyone the satisfaction of a definitive answer. Over time, the caretaker's isolation deepened. She became less involved in the community, and fewer people visited her home. Her life, which had once been filled with the laughter of children, seemed to quiet as the years passed. And yet, the children who had stayed with her never truly left. Their memories lingered in the town, in the homes of the families they had been sent to, in the stories they shared. Some of these children grew up to become adults, but they never forgot the strange, quiet woman who had once taken them in. They, too, carried the weight of their experiences with her, their own fragmented memories of a time in their lives that had never been fully explained. And when they asked about the caretaker, no one could offer them a clear answer. The caretaker's house stood as a monument to all that had been hidden away. It was a place where the past had been buried under layers of time and silence. Yet, the discovery of the trunk, hidden in the attic, tucked away behind layers of dust, would be the first crack in the carefully constructed walls of her life. For years, that trunk had remained untouched, its contents forgotten. But when it was finally opened, the secrets it contained would send ripples to the lives of those who had once known the caretaker, and the mystery of her past would finally begin to unfold. What had she been hiding all these years? Why had she kept her past so carefully guarded? The trunk, with its yellowed papers and faded photographs, would be the key to answering questions that had lingered for decades. And as the investigation began, the caretaker's quiet, solitary life would be exposed to what it truly was, a life full of hidden pain, secrets, and unspoken truths. The children she had cared for were not the only ones whose lives had been marked by the orphan train. The caretaker herself had been part of a much larger, much darker story, one that no one had ever known. And the trunk would reveal it all, piece by piece, memory by memory, until the full extent of the mystery was laid bare for the world to see. The disappearance of Margaret Whitaker was the beginning of the unraveling. Margaret had been just another orphan, one of many who had found themselves on a long journey westward aboard the orphan train. Like so many others, she had been plucked from the streets of New York City, her small, sad face staring up from the crowded orphanage windows. She was only 8 years old when she was selected aboard the train, a child among many who had been deemed unadoptable by the standards of the time. The Children's Aid Society had organized a journey, promising that these children would find new homes, better futures, away from the squalor of the city. But no one knew what would become of Margaret after she stepped off that train in a small, rural town on the outskirts of nowhere. In the beginning, Margaret had been just another name among hundreds, her fate tied to the uncertainty of the orphan train system. She arrived at the caretaker's home with nothing more than clothes on her back and a small, faded piece of paper that listed her name, age, and the vague details of her family's background. She had been quiet, withdrawn, like so many of the other children who came through that house. There was no family to greet her, no warm embrace, only the cold, unfamiliar walls of a new home that would become her world. The caretaker had greeted her with that same reserved kindness, offering her a bed and a meal, but there was something about Margaret that didn't quite sit right. She was different from the other children, more distant, more introspective, and yet there was an odd glimmer of something in her eyes, something that suggested a deeper story. She never cried. She never asked for anything, never even seemed to expect much. She simply accepted her new life with an almost eerie sense of resignation. Days turned into weeks, and still, Margaret said little. She kept to herself, silently moving through the daily routines of the house, her quiet presence barely noticed by the other children. But one morning, when the caretaker came into the kitchen to start the day, she found that Margaret was gone. No one had seen her leave. Her bed was made, her belongings neatly arranged in the small corner where she had slept. At first, the caretaker had assumed that Margaret had gone outside to play, but as the hours wore on and the sun began to dip low in the sky, a feeling of unease crept over the house. The other children hadn't seen her, and there was no sign of her anywhere on the property. The caretaker searched the grounds, calling her name, but there was no answer. It was as if Margaret had vanished into thin air. The disappearance seemed impossible, yet there it was, a child who had simply slipped away, leaving behind no trace. The caretaker didn't panic at first. Perhaps Margaret had simply wandered off. Perhaps she had gone to see the nearby neighbors, or maybe she had simply run away. But the more she searched, the more the feeling of dread deepened. The caretaker called the town sheriff, but after a cursory search, there was still no sign of the girl. The sheriff had his suspicions, but no evidence. There were no clues, no footprints, no signs of foul play. Just an empty room and an empty space where Margaret had once been. Days turned into weeks, and still, no one knew what happened to her. Some townspeople believed she had run off, perhaps frightened by the unfamiliarity of her new life. Others whispered that the caretaker had something to do with it, that Margaret had simply been sent off to another family, though there was no record of such an arrangement. The caretaker, ever stoic, didn't offer much of an explanation. She seemed almost detached from the whole ordeal, as if it were simply a part of the strange, inexplicable things that happen in life. But as time wore on, the town began to grow suspicious. The caretaker's refusal to discuss Margaret's disappearance, her inability or unwillingness to explain what had happened, only deepened the mystery. People began to whisper that perhaps Margaret had met with a worse fate. Maybe she had never left the house. Maybe something had happened to her that the caretaker didn't want anyone to know. The disappearance of Margaret Whitaker became a ghost that haunted the town. It lingered in every conversation, a shadow hanging over the community. There were no answers, only unanswered questions, and the longer the mystery dragged on, the more uncomfortable people became. But then, years later, as the caretaker's help began to fail and the house grew quieter, a peculiar thing happened. The town, still obsessed with the mystery of Margaret's disappearance, began to hear strange rumors. There were whispers of old trunks hidden in attics, of forgotten letters tucked away in forgotten drawers, of things that had been buried for far too long. The caretaker, who had once been so closed off, had begun to show signs of cracks in her carefully constructed wall of silence. It was as if the weight of the past, the truth she had kept hidden for so many years, was finally starting to press down on her, forcing its way to the surface. Some people believed the rumors were simply the ramblings of old people, exaggerations or fabrications designed to stir up trouble. Others believed that the answers to Margaret's disappearance were waiting to be found in the very house that had sheltered her. But as the caretaker's health worsened, a strange sense of urgency began to rise in the air. It was as if the town knew that the answers they had been searching for were finally within reach, just beyond the horizon, and they could sense that the caretaker's time was running out. In the final years of her life, the caretaker's behavior grew more erratic. She became forgetful, her once orderly home now filled with disarray. The children who had once passed through her doors, now grown and long gone, began to return, perhaps seeking answers, perhaps hoping for closure. They had not forgotten the woman who had taken them in. Nor had they forgotten Margaret. Some had moved far away. Others had remained in the town, but none of them could shake the haunting memory of that missing child. They knew, deep down, that something had gone wrong, that something had happened that no one was willing to speak about. As the caretaker's health continued to decline, more and more people began to question the stories they had once accepted without thought. What had truly happened to Margaret? Why had she disappeared without a trace? And why had the caretaker been so unwilling to talk about it? The townspeople began to press harder, demanding answers, searching for clues that had long been hidden. And then it happened, one fateful afternoon. As the caretaker's health finally gave way to the weight of her years, a piece of the puzzle began to fall into place. A trunk, old and weathered, was discovered in the attic of the house. It had been hidden away for years, tucked behind boxes of forgotten belongings. The trunk, seemingly unremarkable, would turn out to be the key to understanding what had happened to Margaret and to uncovering the secrets that the caretaker had hidden for so long. Inside the trunk, among the layers of dust and yellowed papers, lay photographs, dozens of them. The images were old, faded, and often blurry, but they depicted something unmistakable: Margaret Whitaker. There she was, her face a little younger, but unmistakable, her large brown eyes staring directly into the camera. And there, beside her, was the caretaker, looking as she had years ago, still young, still full of purpose, but with something else in her eyes, something that spoke of secrets, of things that were never meant to be known. But it wasn't just the photographs that revealed the truth. There were letters, too, letters that had been carefully hidden, letters that spoke of things that had been buried. As the trunk was opened and the contents were revealed, a chilling realization began to settle over those who were witnessing the discovery. Margaret's disappearance had not been accidental. It had not been a simple case of a child running away. No, there was more to this story. Something darker, something that had been deliberately kept in the shadows for so many years. As the mystery began to unfold, it became clear that Margaret's fate was tied to the very secrets the caretaker had tried so desperately to keep hidden. Her disappearance had been a part of a much larger story, one that had been concealed for far too long. The truth, once buried deep within the walls of the caretaker's home, was now being exposed, and with it came a revelation that would change everything the town thought they knew about the woman they had once trusted. The disappearance of Margaret Whitaker was no longer just a tragic, unresolved mystery. It was a clue, a puzzle piece that, when put together with the others, would reveal a story of hidden lives, forgotten promises, and the terrible price of silence. And as the last of the letters were read aloud, it became clear that the caretaker had been living a lie that had lasted far too long. The trunk that had been stored away for so many years was, at first, just an old relic, a forgotten object buried beneath the dust and cobwebs of the caretaker's attic. The house had been standing for decades, and over time, it had accumulated countless items that had no place in the world outside of that space. The attic was one of those rooms that no one ever thought to visit. It was a forgotten realm of old furniture, clothes that no longer fit, and other keepsakes that had lost their value with the passing of time. But when the trunk was uncovered, it became clear that it was not just any old chest. It was a container of secrets, secrets that had been locked away for far too long. The moment the trunk was opened, the air in the room seemed to shift, and for the first time in years, there was a palpable sense of anticipation, as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath, waiting for what would be uncovered next. Inside the trunk, there were a number of items that seemed utterly ordinary at first glance. Old clothes, worn and frayed from years of neglect, lay at the top, piled up haphazardly. They were clearly relics from another time, perhaps the clothes of the caretaker herself, or of children who had once passed through her care. But beneath the clothes, beneath the worn fabric and the layers of dust, something more significant was hidden. A stack of yellowed papers, fragile and brittle with age, sat tucked away beneath a collection of old photographs, their edges curling up from exposure to the air. The photographs were faded, their details blurry, but they contained faces that looked familiar, faces that had once been a part of the caretaker's world. Among the photographs was a picture of a young Margaret Whitaker, the girl who had disappeared without a trace so many years before. The photograph was haunting, capturing a moment in time when Margaret was just a child, her wide eyes staring up at the camera with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. But it was the note attached to the photograph that was most troubling. It was a brief, cryptic message written in the same hurried, uneven handwriting, as the letter discovered earlier. The message read simply, she wasn't meant to be here. She was never meant to stay. The words, although sparse, hung heavy in the air. They were a key to understanding what had happened to Margaret, to the caretaker, and to the dark history that had been buried beneath layers of silence. The photograph and the note were the first pieces of the puzzle, but they only raised more questions. What had happened to Margaret? Why was she not meant to stay? And who had written the note? The caretaker or someone else? As the investigation into the contents of the trunk continued, more items were uncovered, each one more unsettling than the last. There were more photographs, more images of children who had passed through the caretaker's home, each one with a sad, almost vacant look in their eyes. The children were not the smiling, hopeful faces that one might expect to see in a family album. They were the faces of children who had been through something difficult, something that had robbed them of their innocence. In some of the photographs, the caretaker could be seen in the background, her presence almost ghost-like, always just on the periphery, always watching, but never fully involved. She was there, but never really a part of the scene. Her face, when it appeared in the photographs, was always inscrutable, as though she was guarding some secret that no one could ever guess. It was clear from the photographs that the caretaker had been a constant presence in these children's lives, but it was also clear that her involvement with them was not entirely benign. The way she was captured in these images, always in the background, always a shadow in the lives of the children, spoke volumes about her role in their experiences. It was as if she had been there, but had never truly seen them, never truly cared for them. Instead, she had been a bystander in their lives, someone who had offered them shelter but had not offered them love, someone who provided them with a home but had not given them a place in her heart. The more the investigators examined the photographs, the more it became clear that the caretaker's role was far from simple. She was not just a guardian. She was a figure that loomed over the children's lives, a figure whose presence seemed to shape their fates in ways that no one had ever fully understood. Among the photographs, there were also letters written in the same uneven handwriting that had appeared on the note attached to Margaret's picture. The letters were addressed to various people, but the names were all unfamiliar. Their identities lost time. The letters themselves were filled with vague, disjointed thoughts, fragmented conversations, and cryptic references to events that had taken place long ago. Some of the letters spoke of the children she had cared for, of their departures, and of the empty spaces they left behind. But others were more troubling, more personal, more intimate. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was a letter to an unknown recipient, a letter that spoke of a child who had arrived at the caretaker's home under strange circumstances. The letter described the child as the one who would never leave, and it went on to describe how the caretaker had kept the child close, almost possessively. It was clear from the letter that this child, who was not named, had become the caretaker's obsession. The letter described how the child had grown ill, how the caretaker had tended to her, and how she had tried to keep the child from leaving. The words were full of a strange mix of tenderness and desperation, as though the caretaker had been unwilling to let go of the child, no matter the cost. The letter, like the photograph, raised more questions than it answered. What had happened to the child in the letter? Who was she, and why had the caretaker become so attached to her? Had this child been another orphan, another victim of the orphan train system? Or was she someone else? Someone tied to the caretaker's past, someone whose presence had disturbed the careful balance of the caretaker's carefully constructed life? As the trunk was examined more closely, it became apparent that there were more layers to the story than anyone had initially realized. The caretaker's involvement with the orphan-trained children was not just a matter of charity or duty. It was something much more complex, much darker. She had been a part of a system that had trafficked children, a system that had exploited their vulnerability for reasons that were not always clear. And yet, despite the darkness of that system, the caretaker had also been a victim of it, caught in its web in ways that no one could have predicted. Her role in the movement was not one of simple caregiver, but of someone who had been forced to make difficult choices that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The trunk contained more than just photographs and letters. It also contained a series of old, faded records, official documents that outlined the movement of children across the country. These records, once thought to be lost, contained details of the children who had been sent through the orphan train system, including Margaret Whitaker. As the investigators pored over the records, they found that Margaret had not simply disappeared. She had been deliberately removed from the system, her name erased from the official lists. The reasons for this were unclear, but it was evident that her disappearance had not been an accident. The more the records were examined, the more it became clear that the caretaker had been involved in a deliberate attempt to hide Margaret's fate, to make her vanish, as if she had never existed at all. The discovery of the trunk and its contents marked a turning point in the investigation. What once seemed like an isolated incident, the disappearance of a single child, now appeared to be part of a much larger pattern, a pattern of secrets and lies that stretched back for years. The trunk, with its photographs, letters, and records, had revealed a hidden world, one that had been carefully concealed, locked away from view. And as the pieces of the story slowly began to fit together, it became clear that the caretaker's involvement in the orphan train system had been far more complicated than anyone had ever imagined. She had not just been a passive participant in a system of child relocation. She had been an active participant in the creation of a story that had been deliberately hidden from the world. The trunk, once a simple container of forgotten belongings, had become a testament to a past that had been buried, and when it came the promise of revelation that would change everything. As the investigation continued, the contents of the trunk will reveal more of the truth about Margaret Whitaker, the truth about the caretaker, and the truth about the orphan train system itself. But the discovery was only the beginning. The real question now was what would be done with this truth, and who would be brave enough to face the consequences of uncovering a past so dark and filled with sorrow. The town had long held its secrets, but nothing to compare to the unraveling that had begun with the discovery of the trunk. As more details emerged about the caretaker's life, the mystery of Margaret Whitaker's disappearance became intertwined with the darker history of the orphan train system itself. With each letter, photograph, and record pulled from the trunk, the quiet house on the edge of town seemed less like a home and more like a crypt, filled with the buried truths of lives long lost and forgotten. Yet even with all that had been uncovered, the questions only grew more complex. Why had the caretaker kept so much hidden? Why had she erased Margaret from the official records? And what had really happened to her? What was the connection between the children she had cared for and the system that had sent them west? The deeper the investigation went, the more unsettling the answers became. There were references to children who had disappeared without a trace, children who had simply fallen off the map, as though they had never existed. The authorities, back in the days when the orphan train system was in full swing, had been too overwhelmed by the sheer volume of children to pay attention to every disappearance, every gap in the records. But now, decades later, the ghosts of those missing children were beginning to resurface. Margaret's name was just one of many that had been erased from the annals of the system, and as the investigation into her fate deepened, it became clear that her disappearance was not an isolated incident. There were other children, other names that had been wiped clean, and there were whispers that these children had not simply run away or been adopted elsewhere. No, something far more sinister had been at play, something that had been deliberately hidden, something that had to do with the caretaker herself. The caretaker's past, which had been so carefully obscured, now began to come to light. It was clear from the records that she had not been just an innocent bystander in the orphan train system. She had been deeply involved in it, more so than anyone could have guessed. It wasn't just that she had been tasked with taking in children. No, she had played a much more significant role in the relocation process. She had acted as a sort of intermediary between the Children's Aid Society and the families who were seeking children to adopt. But she had also, it seemed, been involved in a more covert operation, a network of individuals who were involved in the trafficking of children. The records found in the trunk contained references to deals that had been struck in secret, deals that had been carefully hidden from public view. Some of the children who were sent west were not being adopted by loving families. They were being sold to the highest bidder, used as cheap labor for farms, factories, and households. The caretaker had been complicit in this system, and it seemed that her involvement had gone far beyond what anyone could have imagined. But even with these revelations, the true nature of the caretaker's role remained elusive. What had driven her to participate in such a corrupt system? Had she been coerced? Was she simply a product of her time, a woman caught up in a world of poverty and desperation? Or had there been something darker at play, something in her past that had pushed her to make these choices? There were no easy answers, and the more investigators dug into her history, the more they realized that the caretaker had been an enigma even to those who had known her. The caretaker's early life was a mystery in itself. There were no official records, no birth certificates, no family histories. She had arrived in the town many years ago, and no one had ever asked where she had come from. She had simply appeared, a woman with no past, no connections, and no questions asked. For years, she had been a part of the town's fabric, a figure that people accepted without really knowing anything about her. Now, however, it seemed that the answers lay buried somewhere in that past. Somewhere in the fog of her life was a key that would unlock the mystery of her true involvement in the Orphan train system. The more the investigators delved into the caretaker's life, the more disturbing patterns began to emerge. It was clear that she had been involved in the movement from the very beginning. But there was something else, something more troubling, hidden beneath the surface. As they pieced together the fragments of her life, they discovered that she had been involved in the placement of children with families who had no interest in adopting them, but saw the children as nothing more than property to be used. Some families had been eager to exploit the children for their labor, to put them to work on their farms or in their homes, but there were others who had darker intentions. The caretaker had been aware of the mistreatment these children had endured, yet she had not spoken out. Instead, she had continued to facilitate the system, sending children to families who did not care for them as they should have been cared for. Her silence spoke volumes, and as the investigation continued, it became apparent that her role in the orphan train system had been more than just a passive one. She had been a participant in something that had destroyed lives, something that had turned children into nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. Yet, even in the face of these revelations, there was still a sense of mystery surrounding her true motivations. What had driven her to become involved in such a corrupt system? Was it simply a matter of survival, of finding a way to make a living in a world that had little to offer her? Or was there something deeper, something buried in her past that had shaped her into the person she had become? As the investigation into her life continued, it became clear that the answers would not come easily. The deeper they went, the more complicated the story became. There were no simple explanations, no neat conclusions. What had begun as a search for the truth behind Margaret's disappearance had turned into something much darker, an exploration of a system that had destroyed the lives of countless children, and of a woman who had been complicit in that destruction. The question that remained, though, was what would happen now? What would be done with the information that had been uncovered? The caretaker was long gone, her life now a series of disjointed memories and documents that no one had ever fully understood. But her legacy, it seemed, would not fade so easily. The children she had taken in, the lives she had shaped, would continue to carry the scars of the orphan train system for generations to come. And the town, too, would never be the same. The discovery of the trunk had peeled back the layers of history, exposing the town's complicity in a system that had harmed so many. The town's quiet acceptance of the caretaker, its unspoken agreement to overlook the disappearances and the children who were sent away without a second thought, would no longer be something that could be ignored. In the days that followed the discovery, the town found itself at a crossroads. Some wanted to forget what had been uncovered, to move on from the painful truths that had come to light. Others, however, felt that the only way forward was to confront the past, to face the reality of what had happened, and to acknowledge the role that the town had played in the lives of those children. It was a difficult decision, and one that weighed heavily on the hearts of many. But no matter how they chose to proceed, the truth was undeniable. The orphan train system, with all its flaws and its hidden horrors, had left a lasting mark on the lives of countless children, and the caretaker, whether she had been a willing participant or a reluctant one, had played a central role in that system. Her story, and the story of the children she had cared for, would not be forgotten. As the town continued to grapple with the revelations of the past, one thing became clear. The caretaker's secrets had not just been buried in the trunk. They had been buried in the hearts of the children she had touched, in the memories of those who had been affected by the system she had been a part of. And as the truth slowly emerged, it became evident that the town's healing would require more than just a reckoning with the past. It would require a deeper understanding of the trauma that had been inflicted, and a recognition that the past, though painful, must be acknowledged in order for the community to move forward. The mystery of Margaret Whittaker's disappearance had been just the beginning. The real story was one of survival, of broken promises, and of lives that had been forever altered by a system that had failed them. And in uncovering that story, the town would come to understand that the past was not something that could be buried. It was something that had to be reckoned with, no matter how dark the truth might be. As the town continued to piece together the unsettling history of the Orphan train system, it became clear that the discovery of the trunk was not the end, but rather the beginning of a much deeper journey. The revelations surrounding the caretaker's role in that system and the unanswered questions about Margaret Whittaker's disappearance had opened a door to a past that no one had truly understood. The trunk had been a time capsule, holding not only the photographs, letters, and records that shed light on the past, but also the weight of guilt and shame that had long been carried by the community. For years, the town had operated under a veil of ignorance, unwilling to confront the truth of what had occurred in their midst. But now, with the trunk's contents scattered across the town's collective memory, there was no turning back. In the weeks that followed, a wave of emotions swept through the town: anger, disbelief, sadness, and for some, a deep sense of regret. People who had once quietly accepted the caretaker's presence in their community now found themselves questioning everything they had known about her. The woman who had been a shadow in their lives, an enigma whose past had been shrouded in mystery, was now a figure whose actions could no longer be ignored. Yet, even as the details of her involvement in the Orphan train system emerged, a larger, more disturbing question lingered. Why did it take so long for anyone to uncover the truth? Why had the caretaker, despite her secrecy, managed to evade scrutiny for so many years? The town had been complicit, in its own way, in the story that was now unfolding. People had seen the children come and go from the caretaker's house, some with nothing more than a passing glance, others with deeper involvement. But no one had ever thought to ask too many questions. It was easier to look the other way, to assume that things were as they appeared, than to confront the possibility that something darker was at play. The caretaker had never offered any explanations, and the townspeople had never pressed her for them. They had simply accepted her role as a quiet, almost invisible figure in their midst, someone who provided a service to the town's most vulnerable. But now, in the wake of the revelations, it became painfully clear that this collective silence had allowed the darkest parts of the past to fester in the shadows, unchecked. One by one, the former children who had passed through the caretaker's home began to return to the town, drawn back by the weight of the past. Some had been adopted by families far from the town, while others had been sent to live in distant cities or states, far beyond the reach of the small, rural community. But the memories of their time with the caretaker had never fully faded. They had carried with them the knowledge that something had never felt right about those years, that there had always been something more to the story than what had been told. Some had been children too young to understand complexities of what had happened. But as adults, they began to piece together the fragments of their past. The photographs, the letters, the records, each new discovery was a key that unlocked more pieces of their own stories. And as they returned to the town to find answers, the town, too, began to reckon with its own complicity in the system that had failed so many children. Each of these former children had their own story to tell, but there were striking similarities in their accounts. They all spoke of feeling like they had never truly belonged, like they were always outsiders in the homes they had been sent to, even when they were ostensibly adopted by families. There was a constant sense of displacement, the sense that they were not part of the families that had taken them in. Many recalled harsh treatment, cold indifference, and the absence of love or affection from the families who were supposed to care for them. But what struck them most profoundly was the feeling that they had been pawns in a system that had no regard for their well-being. They had been moved from place to place, shuffled around like possessions, their futures shaped by people who cared more about their own needs than the needs of the children themselves. It was as if the caretaker had been a keeper of these children's memories, a woman who had offered them shelter but had kept them at arm's length, never allowing them to become too close, never allowing them to truly feel a home. And yet, for all the distance she had kept, for all the walls she had built between herself and the children in her care, there was something in the way she had treated them that spoke of a deeper, more complex relationship. The caretaker had been a figure of authority, but she had not been a typical maternal figure. She had never shown affection, never offered comfort, but she had never been cruel either. She had been a presence in their lives, a constant reminder that they were not truly free. And when they left her home, they did so with a sense of finality, never to return. They had all been sent away, moved on to other families, other lives, but none of them had ever been able to forget the house, the caretaker, or the strange, uncomfortable feeling that had pervaded their time there. For some, the return to the town was a form of closure, a chance to confront the past, to finally understand what had happened during those formative years. For others, it was an opportunity to seek justice, or at least a measure of understanding. But for all of them, it was a chance to take back control over a chapter of their lives that had been written for them without their consent. And as they gathered in the town to share their stories, to revisit the places that had been a part of their past, they found that their memories were both painful and precious, a complicated tapestry of loss and survival. The town itself, once a place of quiet routines, was now filled with a sense of reckoning. It was no longer enough to simply accept the past. The community now had to face it, to come to terms with the way it had been complicit in a system that had harmed so many children. The discovery of the trunk had brought the past crashing into the present, and it was clear that there would be no going back. The town would never be the same again. The veil of ignorance that had once protected its citizens from the uncomfortable truths of their history had been lifted, and with that lifting came the burden of responsibility. But responsibility was not something the town was accustomed to carrying. The people who had lived there for so many years had always lived under the assumption that they were powerless to change the system, that they were merely observers in a world that was too big and too complicated to challenge. But now, as the former children spoke of their experiences, as the stories of abuse, neglect, and indifference were laid bare, it became clear that the town had a responsibility to make amends, to confront the wrongs of the past, and to ensure that the horrors of the orphan train system were never repeated. As the investigation continued, a quiet shift began to take place within the community. There were those who wanted to forget what happened, to move on as quickly as possible. But there were others who believed that the town needed to do more than just acknowledge the past. They believed that it was time for a reckoning, a time to make reparation for the harm that had been done, to offer a public apology to the children who had been mistreated, and to ensure that their voices were heard. For the first time in many years, the town began to have difficult conversations about the past, about responsibility, and about what it meant to be part of community. It was clear that this reckoning would not be easy, that the process of coming to terms with the past would take time. But the town was beginning to understand that it was the only way forward. The caretaker's secrets had forced them to confront a painful chapter in their history, and in doing so, they had the chance to change the narrative, to ensure that future generations would not forget the lessons learned from the mistakes of the past. As more people came forward with their stories, as the town slowly began to heal from the wounds of the past, one thing became clear. The discovery of the trunk had not only revealed the truth about Margaret Whitaker and the caretaker's role in the orphan train system, it had opened the door to a deeper understanding of the human cost of systems of exploitation and neglect. The town, for all its flaws, had a chance to change, to become a place where such injustices would never again be allowed to fester in the shadows. But that change would only come if the community was willing to confront the truth and to take responsibility for the mistakes of the past. In the end, the real challenge was not in uncovering the secrets of the past, but in finding a way to move forward with that knowledge, to use it to build a better future for those who had suffered, and to ensure that no one was ever forgotten again. As the days passed and the town grappled with the truth of its dark past, a sense of quiet sorrow settled over the community. The discovery of the trunk and the unsettling revelations it contained had not just reopened old wounds. It laid bare the deeper scars that ran through the fabric of the town's history. The caretaker, once seen as a somewhat enigmatic figure, now loomed larger than ever, her role in the orphan train system unfolding in painful fragments. But even more troubling was the realization that the town itself had been complicit in the suffering of countless children. The secrets that had been buried for so long were now exposed, and the weight of those secrets bore down on every citizen, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable reality that they had lived in proximity to an institution of exploitation and cruelty without truly understanding its impact. In the aftermath of the trunk's discovery, the townspeople found themselves at a crossroads. Some believed that they had already done enough. After all, what could they do now that the caretaker was gone and most of the children had long since moved on? The past, they argued, could not be undone. But others felt differently. They were not content to simply let the past slip away again, to bury it in the hopes that time would heal all wounds. For them, the truth had to be acknowledged, not just for their own peace of mind, but for the sake of those whose lives had been permanently altered by the orphan train system. It was a question that divided the community, a question of what responsibility meant, and whether it was enough simply to recognize the wrongs that had been done, or whether something more needed to be done to make amends. The idea of reparations, of offering some form of justice to those who had been mistreated, began to take hold. At first, it was an idea whispered in the back rooms of town hall meetings, a notion passed around in hushed tones among a few concerned citizens. But as more former orphans returned to the town, seeking closure or simply to understand what had happened to them, the idea began to gain traction. Many of these former children had grown into adults who had carried the weight of their experiences in silence. They had been displaced, abandoned, and treated as little more than commodities in a system that had cared for their labor more than their humanity. The stories they told were heartbreaking, filled with moments of neglect, loneliness, and loss. But they were also stories of survival in the face of a system that had done everything it could to strip away their dignity. As more of these voices emerged, the townspeople could no longer ignore the enormity of the wrongs that had been committed. The caretaker had long since passed, but the children who had been sent away to homes that never truly welcomed them were still out there, still carrying the emotional and psychological scars of their treatment. What was the town's responsibility in all of this? Could they simply apologize, or was there something more that could be done? The town began to have difficult conversations, and as these conversations grew more intense, the idea of a formal apology took shape. The townspeople felt that it was no longer enough to simply acknowledge the past. They had to publicly recognize the pain and suffering that the orphan train system had inflicted on so many children. It would not be easy. The community was divided, with some arguing that the past was too distant to be relevant and that resources should be focused elsewhere, while others pointed out that the town had a moral obligation to right the wrongs, no matter how far back they stretched. But there was another question that lingered, one that was even more difficult to answer. How could they make things right? What could be done to repair the damage that had been done to so many lives? An apology alone would not be enough. Many of the children who had been sent through the orphan train system had long since grown up, but the scars of their experiences still ran deep. The emotional wounds they carried could not be erased with a simple apology or even with gestures of goodwill. The damage done to their lives, to their sense of self, was a deep-seated wound that required something more than words. Some suggested that the town could offer compensation, monetary or otherwise, as a way to acknowledge the harm done. Others argued that the children who had passed through the system deserved a more tangible form of restitution. Perhaps access to counseling or therapy, a chance to finally confront the ghosts of their past. But these were complicated suggestions. Offering compensation would raise difficult questions about who would be eligible and how much would be enough. How could the town measure the suffering of those who had been displaced and abused in a system that had cared little for their well-being? And even if money could ease the pain of those who had suffered, could it truly heal the wounds left by years of neglect and mistreatment? As the debate continued, it became clear that this would not be an easy process. The past could not simply be erased, and the wounds of the orphan train system could not be healed overnight. But the conversation was an important one. The town was finally coming to terms with the reality that it had been part of a system that had damaged the lives of countless children, and for the first time in generations, people were openly discussing how they could begin to repair that damage.